Chapter 2 of Golden Ditches. Locks are boat boxes. Have you ever looked at some simple device and wondered, why did it take 1,000 years for someone to invent this? Consider an ordinary match, for example. Man used fire for probably 10,000 years before he discovered a quick and easy way to light one. Probably less than that. For countless centuries, fires were so hard to start that they were kept burning constantly day and night. Fire tenders ranked as very important people and were sometimes put to death for allowing their fires to die. Yet today, matches are so common and so cheap that millions of them are given away every single day. Canal locks, although much larger, are actually less complicated than a household match. Once you have seen them operate, you may well wonder why they were not invented much sooner. This is how they work. A ship is guided into a watertight box with gates on each end. Then the gates are closed and water is either let in or out of the enclosure. It's like putting a cork in a pan and adding water. The cork rises and falls with the level of the liquid in the pan. The ship in a lock does the same. If the ship is to be lifted or locked up, water is allowed to enter until the ship floats up to the desired level. If it is to be lowered, locked down, water is let out of the box. When the proper gate is then opened, the ship moves out into another lake or stream at a new level. Some modern locks can lower or raise a giant freighter or tanker 50 feet in a single operation, lasting but a few minutes. Of course, you may wonder where the water comes from and where it goes. Naturally, it must come from a higher level unless it is pumped. But for the fantastic amount needed to raise an ocean-going ship, pumping is far too slow and costly. A cheap and plentiful supply must always be on hand if locks are to work efficiently. To lift an average ship up and down the 85-foot-high stairs of the Panama Canal requires 52 million gallons of water. If you multiply that by 30 ships, you will find that over 1.5 billion gallons of water might be needed in a single day by the Panama Canal alone. All of that water is lost, too, for it cannot be reused except by another lock at a lower level. Have you any idea how big a swimming pool holding 1 billion gallons would be? Don't worry about it. You'll never see one even half that size. At least 10 of our biggest aircraft carriers would float easily in such a pool. Providing water to operate them has been a pressing problem ever since locks were invented by either the Dutch or the Italians late in the 14th century. In spite of this problem, they have come into general use all over the world. For a time, their only use was to control the water level in irrigation canals. But soon after the first recorded ones showed up in the Netherlands, men of vision foresaw exciting new uses for them. Here at last was a way to lift boats over high watersheds and ease them down the other side. Men dreamed of broad canals for moving seagoing ships. Those dreams quickly became reality. Before long, a fantastic new waterway opened to traffic between the Baltic and North Seas. This narrow ditch, called the Stecknitz Canal, provided a unique answer to a 1,000-year-old dream. Seagoing ships could now avoid the wreck-strewn straits separating Denmark from Norway and Sweden. Bearing the romantic names of Skagerrak and Kattegat, these seething seas had become a watery grave for countless sailors throughout the ages. Boats now sailed up and over the low hills that separated them. An air of mystery surrounds the long since abandoned Stecknitz. Who built and paid for it remains a secret that perhaps lies buried among the wooded hills along the ancient Hythe portage, which it replaced. We do know that a powerful group of German merchants controlled trade throughout northern Europe during the late 14th and early 15th centuries. This organization, known as the Hanseatic League, probably built the Stecknitz. No matter who deserves credit for it, a quick look at the map of northern Europe will show you why this canal was so important. First of all, it lopped nearly 400 miles off the sea voyage around the tip of the Jutland Peninsula. But what is even more important is that the Stecknitz ranks as the first boat canal in all history to use locks. How the old Vikings would have whooped it up had they been on hand for its opening in 1398. Water to lift boats up the 16-foot rise from the Stecknitz River was provided in a rather unusual way. By cutting a very deep channel through the highest ridge of the watershed, groundwater drained into the canal instead of leaking out, as was usually the case. Then, to make the best use of their precious supply, its builders designed the locks to hold 10 boats at one time. Only when the locks were filled were all 10 lifted or lowered to the other level. Sometimes it took days to again fill the locks with both boats and water, but there were few complaints. Such delays seemed trivial compared to the treacherous journey around stormy Cape Skagen. Forward-looking men who watched the small boats climb and descend the Stecknitz locks began to dream of better ways of saving water. One of the best methods was the side-by-side locks. This system operates only when two ships are locked in adjacent channels at the same time, one upbound and one downbound. Water is drained from the one containing the ship headed down into the other holding the upbound vessel. Both ships then pass through on a single lockful of water. Of course, it is impossible to arrange for two ships coming from different directions to reach the locks at the same time. Long waiting periods made this system unpopular, but it is still used where water is scarce. In the 300 years after the Stecknitz opened, hundreds of canals came into use throughout the world. Men had long recognized that water transportation was the easiest and cheapest way to move heavy cargoes over long distances. Even to this day, no better method has been found, but there was one very important failing common to every one of those early canals. They could only handle small boats or shallow draft barges. Cargoes had to be unloaded from seagoing vessels and stowed aboard tiny boats, commonly called lighters. At the other end, the heavy bales and unwieldy casks were again transferred to waiting ships. At best, this proved to be a tiresome and costly arrangement. Then, in 1666, a bold Frenchman by the name of Pierre-Paul Riquet plunged into a project of staggering proportions. Rounding up a crew of 8,000 men and women, he started digging in a big way. Those diggings made maritime history. Here are some pictures of the Panama Canal. What do you think about that? Years later, his Languedoc Canal carried an ocean-going ship all the way across France. Riquet's bold dream of linking the cold Atlantic with the warm blue waters of the Mediterranean came true at last. Too bad he was unable to join his countrymen and the world in the gay opening celebration. Pierre Riquet died only a few months before his fantastic dream was completed. No wonder his waterway is still looked upon as a marvel of engineering. Ships could sail from the Bay of Biscay on the Atlantic southeastward all the way across southern France. They emerged in the Gulf of Lion on the Mediterranean side. First, they climbed the Gironde and the Garonne rivers past the famous cities of Bordeaux and Toulouse. Then they entered the canal, and its giant locks lifted them up and over the tremendous 620-foot-high watershed. Riquet's locks were the largest in the world, and with their help, shipping climbed to new heights. People traveled hundreds of miles to stare in wonder at the ships sailing uphill. An unusual but effective system was used by Riquet to beat the shortage of water in the highest locks. His workmen dug over 40 miles of channels to divert every drop of water from the surrounding hills. This amazing labyrinth worked then, and still does. After 285 years, the Languedoc remains a working waterway passing through some of the most breathtaking scenery in all of France. More than 200 vessels climb up and down its stairs yearly. Barges loaded with building materials and fertilizer shuttle back and forth across the country in company with sleek yachts and shabby fishing boats. Gleaming tankers steam busily between hillside vineyards and bustling ports on the Atlantic and Mediterranean. If these tankers weave a bit more than usual on their downward trips, there is perhaps a sound reason. Quite often they are filled to the brim with fine French wines. You may wonder why the Languedoc and others like it were not brought up to date as ships grew in size. They probably would have been had size been the only factor, but there were several others. Speed was one of the most important. Newer and faster ships could now sail around the Iberian Peninsula in less time than it took to climb up and down the 100 steps of the Languedoc. Finding enough water to fill the giant locks needed for modern ships would have been next to impossible. Besides, larger facilities would have required more men and equipment, which in turn would have resulted in higher tolls. You can readily see that operating a modern canal to handle superships is a very costly undertaking. In fact, canals are only practical where they can save many miles of travel or where there is no other route. An example of the first type is the Panama, which lops thousands of miles off the sea voyage between New York and San Francisco. On the other hand, no ships could possibly pass between Lake Superior and Huron without the famous Soo Canal. As in the past, today's ships continue to outgrow even the largest locks. Our atomic-powered carrier, Enterprise, would not fit into the biggest lock in all the world. This tremendous basin, located at IJmuiden in the Noordzee Canal in the Netherlands, measures 1,315 feet long by 165 feet wide. Sure, the Big E could squeeze her 1,101 foot length in, but what would happen to her 252 foot wide flight deck? Nevertheless, there is a boat box capable of handling this world's largest ship. It is a boat basin specially designed to allow her flight deck to overhang 36 feet on either side. Instead of being part of a waterway, this 88 million gallon tank is located at the U.S. Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington. Here, the Enterprise can be locked in, and 3 hours and 50 minutes later, she will stand high and dry. After the stopper is pulled, it takes that long to drain the water from this bathtub for battleships, which measures 1,180 feet long, 180 feet wide, and 61 feet deep. Although it is officially called a dry dock, it is nothing more than a simple lock. About 283 years after the opening of the first boat canal using locks, Riquet's Languedoc cleared its first ship through. But in the meantime, daring diggers had made the dirt fly all across Europe and Asia. Even before the Stechnitz had time to become famous, a new waterway slashed across the Jutland Peninsula.